Hello, friends, and welcome to Stories of Earth. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what are you doing right now? Maybe you're relaxing, studying, or just enjoying a calm moment. Tell me in the comments. I really enjoy reading where you all are tuning in from. Now, take a deep breath. Let's slow down for a while and explore another story of our planet together. Before humans, before memory itself, the world belonged to giants. Forests stretched unbroken from pole to pole, dense and green, humming with the slow rhythm of life. Ferns grew taller than houses. Rivers moved like living veins through continents that had not yet learned their final shapes. In that ancient warmth, the air was thick with sound, a deep chorus of wings, bellows, and thunderous footsteps. The ground trembled not from storms, but from movement, from creatures so vast that their shadows dimmed the light. They were the rulers of deep time, the dinosaurs. For more than 100 million years, they shaped the planet's story. Evolution tried 1,000 designs, plated backs, wings of leather, teeth like sabres, and each survived because it fit the rhythm of its age. Nothing challenged them, nothing dared. Yet the earth beneath them was never still. Continents drifted like slow ships. Volcanoes breathed clouds that changed the air itself. Seas rose and fell. Every paradise hides its own clock, ticking quietly toward change. As ages passed, forests burned and grew again. Species vanished, replaced by new forms built from the same eternal materials: bone, hunger, and time. Even the mightiest were only chapters, never the book. In that calm, sunlit world, a quiet equilibrium reigned. Herds of long-necked titans grazed among trees that reached the clouds. Predators watched with yellow eyes from the shadows, their muscles ready, their senses sharp. Survival was brutal, but it was balanced. Each life ended so that another could begin. On open plains, herds moved like living continents. Their footsteps sank into soft mud, leaving prints that would outlive them by millions of years. Tails swept the air in slow arcs. Heads rose above the canopy, searching for danger, then lowered again to strip branches clean. Dust rose behind them in gentle clouds, glowing in shafts of afternoon light. Far away, along a coastline that no longer exists in our time, waves rolled in on shores lined with strange trees. Giant reptiles swam in the shallows and cruised in deeper water, their bodies built for a different world. Above, great flying reptiles glided on wide wings, catching warm currents that rose from the land. Their shadows slid over the sand, here for a second, gone in the next. In the dense interior forests, the air was cooler, dim, full of mist and drifting spores. Light filtered down in soft beams that caught tiny insects in the air. There, smaller dinosaurs moved quietly between roots and fallen trunks, scales patterned like leaves and bark. Every patch of ground held a story. Every broken branch, every scent on the air meant life or death to something. And somewhere beneath the roots and soil, Tiny mammals stirred, small, fragile, unnoticed. They hid from giants living in the gaps of history, in burrows and hollows and the empty spaces under rocks. Their eyes were bright but cautious. Their lives were short, but their line was patient. No one would have imagined that these trembling creatures, no larger than a hand, would one day inherit everything. Day followed day, in a rhythm so long and steady that it felt unbreakable. The sun rose over wetlands where dragonflies the size of birds skimmed over still water. It set beyond ridges where predators roamed, their calls echoing into the blue distance. Nights were deep and dark, but even then the world was not silent. In the shadows, shapes moved, eyes reflected starlight, and soft calls carried through the trees. Storms swept across entire continents. Lightning split the sky in branching veins of light. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on leaves, filling hollows, feeding rivers. Floods came and went. Forests that had seemed eternal were uprooted in days, washed away, and then, over many years, grew back as if nothing had happened. Destruction, then renewal, over and over. The dinosaurs were not aware of their own age. They did not know they were dinosaurs. They did not know that we would one day give them names, measure their bones, and reconstruct their shapes from fragments buried in stone. They simply lived, moment to moment, in a world that fit them perfectly. A hunting scene played out on some forgotten plain. A group of agile predators, no bigger than a modern car, moved in silence through waist-high ferns. Ahead, a young herbivore lowered its head to drink from a shallow pool. The air was hot, vibrating with the hum of insects. One careless step, one snapped twig, and the scene changed. Muscles tensed, teeth flashed. The quiet turned into panic. For a few seconds the world shrank to dust, blood, and motion. Then it was over. The herd fled. The predators fed. Above them the sky remained unchanged, a deep, brilliant blue, as if none of it mattered. The planet had seen so much life rise and fall that another death, another struggle, was just a small ripple on a very deep ocean. Yet far beyond that blue, beyond the thin shell of air that wrapped the world, something else was moving. High above the clouds, above the highest reach of any wing, space was empty and cold. In that silence, a fragment of rock wandered, older than any creature, older than any forest, older than the dinosaurs themselves. It had no thoughts, no intention. It did not know its destination. It had been part of larger bodies, broken apart in ancient collisions, reshaped by gravity, nudged by invisible forces. For almost all of its existence, it had meant nothing to Earth. But orbits change, paths intersect. Above the blue curve of the sky, that small body drifted through the dark. A fragment of rock, older than the mountains, silent for billions of years. It had no purpose, no will, but its path was perfect. In the endless silence of space, it turned toward Earth. Below, the world continued, unaware. A herd moved slowly along the edge of a lake as evening approached. Water mirrored the red and gold of the sky. Somewhere nearby, a forest caught the last light of day, its leaves shimmering like a sea of green. Insects called from the undergrowth. Small animals moved in the spaces between roots. Far across the water, a slow line of long-necked giants stepped carefully down to drink. In the trees, bird-like dinosaurs slept with their heads tucked under their arms. Others rearranged nests, turned eggs, listened to the rustle of the forest. Life was not peaceful in a gentle way, but it was consistent. Danger existed everywhere, yet every creature knew its place. Hunter and prey, strong and weak, giant and tiny, all part of one vast pattern. This was the world at its height, confident and full. An age that had lasted so long, it seemed like the only possible version of reality. But reality was about to change. If you could have watched the sky from above, you would have seen the incoming stone glowing faintly as it met the first wisps of atmosphere. At first, it was just a point of light, no different from a star. Then it grew brighter, carving a line across the upper air, heating the gases around it, turning darkness into fire. On the ground, the first sign was a strange brightening on the horizon, too fast, too focused to be dawn. Shadows stretched in the wrong direction. Birds shifted uneasily on their branches. Some animals lifted their heads, sensing something they could not fully understand. Life continued, unaware. Thunder lizards crossed plains that steamed beneath the sun. Pterosaurs traced lazy spirals over inland seas. Somewhere in the deep forest, an egg cracked open, and a new creature took its first breath. Everything still made sense. The rhythm of life pulsed without interruption, until one day it changed. The horizon brightened, not with true dawn, but with fire. A second sun appeared low in the sky, growing larger with every heartbeat. Light flooded the landscape in harsh, unnatural colours. For a brief, impossible moment, the world was illuminated more than it had ever been. Birds screamed and scattered. It was instinct. They did not know why. On the ground, animals began to run, but there was nowhere to run to. The air itself began to roar. A pressure wave raced ahead of the falling stone, compressing the atmosphere, pushing walls of air outward. Trees bent, then snapped. Dust lifted from the ground in sheets. Small creatures were thrown from their hiding places, tumbling through the undergrowth. The ground began to shake. For the first time in 100 million years, the rulers of Earth looked up. They would not understand what they saw. They would never have time to learn. The sound that followed was not thunder. It was the sky itself breaking, a single impossible note, low and high at once, rolling around the planet faster than any storm. In the place where the stone met the earth, rock turned to liquid in an instant. An entire region became a crater of fire. But even far away, on the other side of the world, the day shifted. Animals paused, water rippled, leaves shivered on branches that had never known such a force. In minutes, forests ignited. not from below but from above, as burning fragments rained down from the high atmosphere. Waves rose and crashed along distant shores as the oceans reacted. The calm, slow heartbeat of the world accelerated into chaos. And yet, for a tiny interval between the moment of impact and the full spread of its consequences, there was a strange stillness. A breath held, a line crossed. The age of giants, the one that had seemed eternal, had stepped into its final moments. The clock inside the paradise had started to ring. The sound that followed was not thunder. It was the sky itself breaking, a sound deeper than hearing, a vibration felt in bone and stone and air. The world shuddered. Mountains rang like hollow drums. Forests bent as if the wind itself had turned solid. In that moment, the earth was both alive and wounded. Where the stone met the planet, light became something else, not brightness, but a white so complete that shadows ceased to exist. Rock turned liquid. Oceans rose in walls that folded back on themselves. The surface of the world rippled like a single body, taking one vast breath of pain. The blast wave raced outward at the speed of thought. Across a continent, trees bowed, snapped, and vanished in clouds of ash. Animals that had stood still in fear were gone before the sound reached them. The air, once soft and full of life, became a weapon, compressed, heated, roaring with invisible force. Then came the rain of fire. Fragments of the sky, stones reborn in flame, fell in billions. Each carried a piece of the impact's heat, glowing red, then white, then fading into dust as it struck. The surface of the sea hissed and boiled. Rivers shrank into steam. Lakes turned to craters of mud and glass. Far from the impact, the horizon still burned. For hours the clouds glowed orange, and night refused to come. The air smelled of metal and burning resin. Even creatures deep in the ocean felt it. The sudden warming, the shock that ran through the water like an unseen current. In the first day, half a world died. In the first week, the other half began to follow. Flames circled the globe. Forests that had taken centuries to grow disappeared in a night. The oxygen that once fed life now fed fire. Ash drifted upward, blackening the sun. The sky turned the colour of rust, then of iron. The light that filtered through was dim and red, as if the world had been cast inside a forge. Animals fled, but there was nowhere to go. The air itself grew thin, then thick, then poisonous. Breathing became effort. Flight became impossible. The great wings that once ruled the skies folded forever. And still, it was only the beginning. Weeks later, when the fires had eaten everything that could burn, a new silence began. The heat was replaced by cold. Ash hung in the upper air, circling the earth, blocking the sun. The days darkened until day and night were the same, a long twilight without warmth. Temperatures fell, rain turned to sleet. The oceans cooled. The rhythm of the planet slowed, as if time itself had grown tired. The great herds wandered through the dimness, searching for what was no longer there. Leaves had vanished, streams had frozen, The calls of predators faded into hunger and stillness, and then came the long starvation. In the deepening dark, the bones of giants lay scattered, dust gathered in the hollows of ribs large enough to shelter small creatures. The weight of silence pressed on everything, but not everything ended. Beneath the frozen surface, life hid. In burrows and crevices, in caves warmed by the faint heat of the earth, smaller beings waited. Insects, amphibians, birds no larger than a fist, and the tiny mammals that had once hidden from the shadows of giants. Their hearts beat slower. Their bodies survived on little. They did not know they were witnesses to the end of an era. They only knew cold, hunger, and darkness. Yet inside that darkness, the spark of life still burned. Above them, the world changed shape. Continents cracked and shifted from the force of the impact. Tides rearranged the coastlines. Rain fell black for months, filling valleys with poison. The sound of thunder never fully stopped. The planet itself was still ringing. Years passed, measured not in seasons, but in layers of ash. The light that finally returned was thin and pale, weak as a memory. Plants that had once reached for the sun now clung to life in miniature. Mosses, ferns, the stubborn green that grows even where nothing should. The survivors crawled out from hiding. They blinked in the grey light, walked among the remains of a world they would never understand. The bones of the fallen giants towered over them like monuments. Rivers ran slow between skeletons. The air was quiet. From the ashes of the forest floor, seeds began to sprout again. Rain washed away the soot. The earth, exhausted, exhaled. And for the first time in years, a fragile green shimmered against the black. The catastrophe had burned through the planet's memory. Yet life, persistent, patient, endlessly inventive, began to rewrite the story. The giants were gone, but their legacy fed the soil. Their dust became the foundation of something new. In the centuries that followed, the world balanced on a knife's edge between ruin and renewal. Temperatures rose again. The atmosphere cleared. Clouds thinned until sunlight returned, faint and golden. By then the world was changed beyond recognition. The old forests were gone, replaced by strange new growth. The air was cooler, the days shorter. The rule of reptiles had ended, and in their absence, opportunity spread like light into empty space. From that emptiness came voices, small at first, the rustle of leaves, the call of insects, the scurry of something quick and warm-blooded. Then, slowly, the rhythm of life returned. The world had been broken and remade. The surface was scarred, but alive. And in that wounded landscape, among the ruins of an ancient order, the story of survival began anew. The earth had fallen silent, but not forever. The great reset had begun. For a long time after the sky broke, the world forgot what daylight felt like. The fires, the storms, the falling stones, those were sudden, violent moments. But what followed was slower, quieter, and in many ways far more cruel. It was not a single night. It was a season of darkness that lasted for years. dust and ash circled high above the clouds, forming a blanket that wrapped the planet. Sunlight, once warm and generous, arrived weak and thin, like a candle seen from the bottom of a well. The blue of the sky faded into a dull, heavy grey. Dawn and dusk became almost the same. Temperatures dropped, first gently, then sharply. Forests that had once trembled under the weight of giants now stood still, pale and brittle. Leaves, already scorched by fire, withered and fell. Young shoots never saw enough light to grow. Fields of ferns, once endless seas of green, collapsed into carpets of brown. In this half-light, hunger took command. The great plant-eaters had nothing left to graze. They wandered through empty landscapes, past the blackened silhouettes of trees, searching for any trace of green. Their massive bodies, built for abundance, were suddenly too heavy, too expensive to keep alive. Rib cages became visible beneath sagging skin. Steps grew slower. Voices cracked into weak, uncertain calls. Predators followed behind them, not as hunters, but as shadows. There was less and less to chase, more and more to scavenge. The balance that had ruled the world for so long was broken. The intricate chain of energy that ran from sunlight to leaf, from leaf to herbivore, from herbivore to predator, now had a missing link. Without plants, everything else was living on borrowed time. Days blended into one another, each as dim as the last. There were no dramatic sunrises, no blazing sunsets, just a constant, muted twilight. Rain still fell, but it felt different now, colder, longer, soaked with ash. It carved grey lines through the soot that coated rocks and bones. Rivers carried away the remains of forests, turning dark and heavy. Lakes filled with fine dust that settled in layers, preserving a silent record of this long, strange night. Among the dead trunks and silent valleys, the bones of dinosaurs lay exposed, some still articulated, as if the animals had simply lain down and never risen again. Others scattered by water, by small scavengers, by time. Wings, once mighty, now lay folded in the mud. Teeth that had ruled the food chain for millions of years gleamed uselessly in the weak light. Horns, crests, armor plates, all the extravagant designs of evolution, now reduced to nothing more than shapes fading back into the earth. Yet even here, not everything was still. In the shadow of ribs taller than a house, small shapes moved. Tiny lizards, insects, worms, and the shy, whiskered forms of mammals crept between bones. They dug tunnels in the soft soil. They nested in skulls. They slept in the hollows of vertebrae. To them, the skeletons of giants were not monuments, but shelter. Life had pulled itself inward, retreating into corners where the cold could not fully reach. Under the ground, in deep burrows, the temperature was more stable. Seeds, nuts, and roots could be stored. Bodies could huddle together to share warmth. The outside world might be dying, but in these hidden pockets, a quiet, stubborn life continued. Some mammals fed on what remained of the old world, eggs left unguarded, insects that had adapted to the dark, fungus that grew on rotting wood and flesh. They did not need wide open plains or towering forests. They needed only small spaces, small resources, and time. They had all three. Above them, the atmosphere was slowly changing. With less sunlight, some gases in the air diminished. With fewer trees, the balance of oxygen and carbon shifted again. The earth, even in silence, was still breathing, differently now, but still breathing. Years turned into decades. The thickest dust began to fall, settling into soft layers that blanketed continents. Every footprint, every toppled tree, every fallen body was gently covered, then covered again, pressed into the deepening record of the planet's memory. The sky, over time, grew a little lighter. Not all at once. Some days remained darker than others. Some storms returned, bringing back the feeling of the first catastrophe. But slowly, almost shyly, light began to filter through. The first sign was not a sunrise, but a shadow. Where once there had been only uniform grey, faint shapes appeared, the outline of a hill against a slightly brighter horizon, the delicate pattern of branches traced against a thin band of pale sky. In this fragile light, something remarkable happened. The green returned. At first, it was only here and there, a patch of moss on a rock, a thin sprout pushing through packed ash, a tiny fern unfurling beneath a fallen trunk. These pioneers were not the same plants that had covered the dinosaur world. They were harder, more modest, able to survive on less. Roots moved down through dust and bone, seeking moisture, anchoring themselves in the ruins. With every new leaf, a little more sunlight was captured, a little more energy brought back into the system. The long silence, while still heavy, began to soften. The animals that had survived underground crawled back into the open. Their eyes squinted in the unfamiliar brightness. Their senses, sharpened by fear and hunger, scanned the landscape. It was not the world of their ancestors. It was colder, emptier, stranger, but it was open. In a clearing filled with low, scruffy plants, a small mammal paused. It lifted its head, its nose twitching in the cool air. There were no thunderous footsteps nearby. No shadows of giant wings passed overhead. No roaring calls shook the ground. The great noise of the old world was gone. In its place was something quieter, but full of possibility. The rustle of low plants in the wind, the buzzing of a few brave insects, the distant drip of water from melting ice. Piece by piece, ecosystems stitched themselves back together. Birds, descendants of the small, feathered dinosaurs that had found ways to endure, took to the skies again. But their skies were different now, less crowded, less dangerous, more open to experiment. Where dinosaurs had once filled almost every niche on land, air, and in many waters, now there were gaps, empty roles, vacant positions in the grand play of life. Nature does not like emptiness. Given time, it always tries to fill it. And so in the quiet after the catastrophe, evolution accelerated. not in dramatic bursts that any single creature could notice, but in slow generational shifts, a slightly longer limb here, a sharper tooth there, better hearing, thicker fur, more flexible hands. Each small change, on its own, was almost nothing. Together, over thousands and millions of years, they would rewrite the shape of life on Earth. But that future was still far away. For now, the planet rested between eras. Behind it, an age of giants turned into stone. Ahead of it, an age of thought and language and fire still slept unnoticed in the blood of tiny creatures hiding in the grass. The long silence was not empty after all. It was a pause, a slow, deep breath before the next chapter began. For a long time the world lived under a dim and distant sun. The memory of fire in the sky lingered in the rocks, in the soil, in the bones of the dead. But memories fade, even on a planetary scale. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the light began to return. It did not come back in a single sunrise. There was no sudden curtain lifting, no clear morning when everything was bright again. It happened the way most real change does, quietly in small steps, almost unnoticed. High above the earth, the dust and ash that had once wrapped the planet began to settle. Some particles fell back down with rain, sinking into rivers and oceans. Others drifted outward, lost to space. Layer by layer, the thick blanket around the world thinned. The sky, which had spent years in a heavy grey, shifted shade by shade, first to a lighter grey, then to a washed-out blue, fragile and pale. On some days, for a few hours, the sun broke through more clearly, casting sharper shadows on a landscape still scarred and empty. Where the light touched, something stirred. On slopes of bare rock and in valleys filled with ash, the first plants of the new age began to grow. They were not tall, not majestic, not ancient. They were simple, mosses, grasses, small, hardy shrubs. Their roots pushed through powder and broken stone, searching for water, anchoring themselves in instability. They did not know it, but they were the pioneers of a new world. In the rich, dark layers formed from the bodies of the giants and the remains of forests long burned, there was plenty to feed on. Nutrients, minerals, carbon, all waiting to be used again. The planet had been brutal, but it had not been wasteful. Everything that had died now nourished what came next. The return of light brought back colour. Where everything had been shades of black, brown and grey, small patches of green appeared. First scattered, then more frequent. A hillside became dotted with plants like tiny islands. A riverbank turned soft and fuzzy with new growth. Within a few generations of these small plants, the landscape looked less like a graveyard and more like a beginning. Rain patterns changed too, with new plant life catching moisture, holding soil in place. Rivers settled into new paths. Floods became gentler. Lakes found stable shorelines again. The roar of constant erosion softened into the slower, patient work of everyday weather. The air changed with it. Every new leaf captured sunlight and carbon, releasing oxygen. The atmosphere, which had been choking on ash and imbalance, slowly moved back toward a new equilibrium, not identical to the one before the impact, but stable enough for life to breathe, grow, and experiment again. Animals, those that had survived in hiding, began to venture further. Small reptiles basked on stones warmed by thin sunlight. Birds tested the air with cautious flights, hopping from low bushes to emerging trees. Amphibians traced old instincts, returning to the edges of streams and ponds, their calls echoing faintly in the cool air. And then there were the mammals. For millions of years they had been footnotes in the story of life on land. Background details, night wanderers, burrow dwellers, creatures that lived in the margins because the main stages were occupied by giants. Now, for the first time, the stage was empty. When the light returned, the mammals came out of their shadows. They were still small compared to what would come later, creatures the size of mice, rats, squirrels, perhaps a cat at most. They crept through underbrush, climbed the first new trees, swam in streams. Their bodies were warm-blooded, wrapped in fur, their hearts beating faster than any dinosaurs had. Warm blood was expensive. It required more food, more energy, constant maintenance. But in a world where temperatures swung and conditions changed, it was also an advantage. They could stay active in colder air. They could move at night when the weak sun disappeared and the darkness returned. They could explore times and places that other survivors struggled to use. The return of light did not immediately erase danger. The planet still had predators, crocodiles in the rivers, large reptiles in some corners, teeth and claws that had survived the extinction. But the giant land hunters were gone. There was no longer a rule that said the largest body always won. In this new world, the winners would not be the biggest, but the most adaptable. Step by step, the landscapes of Earth changed shape. Where once there had been endless conifer forests and fern plains, new plants appeared. Flowering plants, grasses, early forms of broad-leaved trees. Their colours and scents attracted insects, which in turn attracted small predators. This created a fresh foundation for entire food webs. In one valley, a forest of low trees took hold. Their branches spread wide rather than tall, adjusting to winds and the quality of the new soil. Between them, bushes and shrubs created layers of habitat. In the leaf litter below, insects flourished. Spiders spun webs between sturdy stems. Worms and beetles turned dead leaves into richer soil. A small mammal, no larger than your hand, moved along a fallen branch. Its nose twitched at the scent of something edible. It found an insect, then another, a seed, a tender shoot. In these scattered moments of feeding and moving and surviving, evolution was silently choosing which bodies, which instincts, and which behaviours would guide the future. The return of light did something else too. It brought back time. During the years of darkness and disaster, survival had been about seconds and hours. Find shelter now, avoid fire now, endure cold today. With a more stable climate and a predictable cycle of day and night, creatures could plan, not consciously, but in pattern. They could explore territories, establish home ranges, return to the same nesting sites, adjust to the changing length of seasons. Life gained a rhythm again, one that could support more complex strategies. Some mammals began to climb. Trees offered safety from predators, food in the form of fruits and leaves, and vantage points to see danger below. Grasping paws and flexible joints became useful. Tails that could help with balance became an advantage. Eyes that faced forward, improving depth perception, made judging distances in branches easier. Others stayed closer to the ground. They ran through undergrowth, dug deeper burrows, or adapted to life near water. Some became better at chewing tough plant material. Some developed sharper teeth for catching small prey. Some did both, adjusting their diets as needed. Every new forest, every recovering plain became a laboratory. Every generation a test. The planet, still carrying the scars of the impact, did not simply heal back into what it had been. It moved forward into something different. The old ecosystems could not be rebuilt exactly as they were. Too many pieces were missing. Too many conditions had changed. Instead, a new design emerged, a world with more open space, more room for quick, flexible, warm-blooded animals to explore. Skies once ruled by huge reptilian wings were now increasingly filled with birds. Land once dominated by massive reptilian legs was now home to smaller, faster, more agile bodies. The measure of power shifted from sheer size to something else: speed, intelligence, cooperation, curiosity. From the outside, if you could have watched this as a slow-motion film over millions of years, it would have looked almost gentle. Green spreading, animals changing shape, continents quiet, seas calm, no great explosions, no burning skies, just the steady, patient unfolding of possibility. But inside that calm picture, there was constant competition. Not the kind you see in movie scenes, no endless roaring battles, but quiet, continuous pressure. Who finds food? Who avoids predators? Who raises offspring? Who doesn't? Life did not decide to move toward mammals, or toward intelligence, or toward humans. The universe has no script. There was only an environment that rewarded certain patterns more than others. In this new, cooler, more varied world, those patterns often involved sharper senses, better memory, more flexible behaviour. The return of light had reopened the future. What filled it would be chosen, bit by bit, by survival itself. On a late afternoon in that recovering world, the sky might have looked almost familiar to us. A soft blue with thin clouds drifting lazily. The sun low, painting the tops of young trees gold. Birds crossing from one side of the horizon to the other. The air filled with the smells of growth and damp earth. On the ground, though, the witnesses were different. No dinosaur eyes watched the sunset. No giant bodies settled into sleep under the trees. Instead, in the shadows, Small mammals cleaned their fur, checked the air, and listened. Their world was still full of risk. Owls in the dark, snakes in the grass, lurking reptiles in the water. But for the first time in the history of land animals, the space was open for creatures like them to become more than background. The long night was over. The planet had survived its own catastrophe, and in the soft light of a new age, evolution quietly shifted its focus. The giants were gone. The stage was set for something different, an age not of enormous bodies, but of minds slowly waking up. The world was quieter now. The echo of thunder lizards was gone, and in their place came smaller sounds, rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the soft scratching of paws against soil. For the first time in millions of years, the earth was no longer ruled by giants. And in that silence, something new began to move. Mammals, once nothing more than frightened night creatures, started to explore the daylight. The world that had terrified them, a place of claws and shadows, was suddenly open. They crept out of burrows, sniffed the air, and discovered that the ground no longer shook beneath the steps of massive predators. The first generation after the catastrophe were simple, small bodies, quick hearts, hungry minds. They were creatures of instinct, built to survive scarcity and change. Each heartbeat was a gamble. Every rustle in the grass could mean danger. Every new scent could mean food. But where the dinosaurs had needed strength and size, the mammals relied on something else: awareness. They noticed things. They learned. They remembered. It started with the simplest behaviours, remembering where food was hidden, which paths were safe, which sounds meant danger. Those tiny advantages, repeated across generations, began to change their brains. Neurons formed new pathways. Memory became more complex. Fear turned into pattern recognition. Instinct turned into choice. The new world rewarded flexibility. The climate shifted often. Warm periods, then cooler ones. Wet seasons followed by drought. Mammals could move, migrate, and adapt. They gave birth to live young, cared for them, taught them small lessons through example. In that care, in that sharing of knowledge, the future of intelligence took root. Forests grew again, though not the same as before. Instead of towering conifers, flowering trees spread, oak, beech, and magnolia, ancestors of the forests we know. Their fruits and seeds fed insects, birds, and mammals alike. The ground was alive with motion, scurrying, climbing, gliding. Each niche in the environment became an experiment. Some mammals stayed small, darting through undergrowth in flashes of fur. Others grew larger, discovering that size could again mean safety, but not the impossible scale of dinosaurs. Bodies remained manageable, adaptable. Speed mattered more than weight. A line of small, fox-like creatures hunted in packs. They worked together, using simple communication, growls, gestures, patterns of movement. Another lineage learned to swim, their limbs flattening, their fur thickening to hold warmth in cold water. Another took to the trees, grasping branches with flexible paws and curling tails. The age of mammals had no single face. It was an age of diversity. On one continent, which would one day become North America, the land was covered in humid forests. There, early primates with round eyes and small hands leapt from branch to branch, their bodies light, their reflexes sharp. On another continent, still drifting away from the south, herds of hoofed mammals grazed in open plains, their new teeth designed for grinding the tough grasses that had begun to dominate the earth. In the oceans, ancient lineages of swimming mammals adapted further, turning forelimbs into flippers and developing lungs that could hold breath for long, deep dives. Everywhere, the same story unfolded: experiment, variation, survival. But evolution is not generous. For every new form that thrived, another failed. The earth was still full of trials: earthquakes, volcanoes, climate swings. Extinctions came and went like tides, sweeping away the unprepared, leaving behind only those whose luck aligned with adaptation. Time passed in quiet revolutions. Millions of years flowed by in the rhythm of heartbeat and rainfall. Continents drifted toward their modern positions. Mountains rose, eroded, rose again. Rivers carved new paths. The map of life shifted constantly, and through it all the mammals endured. They became the storytellers of survival, not because they understood their own story, but because they lived it every day. Their bodies carried the lessons of those who had come before: warm blood, parental care, curiosity. These were their inheritance. In the night, under starlight that shone on a quieter planet, one could hear the sound of breathing from countless burrows and nests. Small lives, each fragile, yet together forming a chorus of persistence. And slowly, very slowly, that persistence turned into something more. Brains grew larger relative to body size, senses sharpened, communication became richer. The world's temperature stabilized into a range that favored energy and activity. The descendants of the timid survivors began to dominate, not through violence or conquest, but through numbers, adaptability, and time. The reptiles that remained, crocodiles, lizards, turtles, stayed true to their ancient ways, content in their unchanged perfection. But the mammals moved differently. They explored, they experimented, they took chances. They became the restless force of life itself. One lineage in particular began to look up more often than the rest. Its eyes, set forward, judged distance and light. Its hands, flexible and curious, reached for fruit, stones, branches. Its mind, already restless, began to play. The first primates, the whisper of what would one day become human. They were still far from it, millions of years and countless changes away, but the spark was visible, faint but undeniable. A kind of quiet awareness that looked not just at the world, but into it, a sense of "I am here." As forests spread across the continents, these small primates thrived. They lived in groups, shared space, protected one another's young. The bonds they formed were more than instinct. They were emotional, rooted in recognition and memory. Somewhere deep in those early brains, the architecture of empathy began to appear. It would take ages to grow into language, art, and thought, but it had already begun. The rise of mammals was not a sudden triumph. It was a slow expansion, the gentle reclaiming of a planet that had once been too loud, too dangerous, too full of teeth. Now, under a gentler sun and a cooler sky, the earth belonged to creatures that dreamed in small ways. Their dreams were of safety, food, warmth, family. But in those dreams was the seed of imagination, the ability to see a world that did not yet exist. And from that ability, everything that would follow, fire, tools, music, civilization, had its first quiet spark. The air had changed. It was cooler now, but alive with sound. The buzz of insects, the calls of birds, the steady rhythm of wind through trees, all stitched together into a new kind of harmony. The world no longer belonged to thunder and fire. It belonged to breath. Everywhere warm-blooded life was thriving. It was a quiet revolution. Unlike the great reptiles before them, these creatures carried their warmth within. They did not depend on the sun to wake or the shade to rest. Their hearts burned like tiny furnaces, steady and tireless. This inner fire was costly. It demanded constant feeding, but it gave freedom. Freedom to move in the chill of morning, freedom to hunt in the dark of night, freedom to survive change. The pulse of the earth itself seemed to sync with theirs. Each generation, more species emerged that could think faster, move longer, and adapt deeper. The mammals, small, quick, endlessly curious, had taken the planet's chaos and turned it into rhythm. Over millions of years, their shapes diversified, claws into fingers, legs into flippers, spines into wings. Some grew heavy and powerful, others light and silent. But across them all was one unifying trait: warmth. Warmth of body, warmth of care. For unlike the cold, distant reptilian world that had come before, this new age was filled with connection. Mothers nurtured their young longer, teaching them, protecting them. Families and herds formed. Group memory took root. That warmth of blood, of touch, of memory was the blueprint of something extraordinary. In the tall canopies of forests, primates flourished. Their hands grasped, their eyes faced forward. Their movements were measured and deliberate. They played, they fought, they learned. When a young one fell, others gathered around it. When danger approached, voices called out, a pattern of warning and response. It was not language yet, but it was structure, the first rhythm of communication. Below the trees, on the expanding plains, new mammals tested the ground. They walked farther, hunted in pairs, raised offspring together. They built invisible maps in their minds, where the rivers lay, where the food was plentiful, where safety waited. Memory became survival's greatest tool, and the more they remembered, the more they could imagine. Imagination, that strange extension of memory, was the invisible frontier opening before them. It began simply, anticipating a predator's move, predicting the season's change, hiding food for later. But slowly, thought stretched beyond the present moment. What if? Where next? How long? That was the true birth of intelligence, not the ability to react, but the ability to foresee. On one ancient afternoon, under the filtered light of a forest canopy, a small primate sat holding a stick. It had used it to reach insects inside a fallen log. The meal was finished, yet the stick remained in its hand. The creature turned it over, examining it. A moment passed, a pause not filled with instinct, but with curiosity. That pause was the first flicker of invention. The age of warm blood had made such moments possible. It had built the biological stage, faster metabolism, longer childhood, more flexible thought, upon which imagination could stand. Seasons came and went. Winters tested the endurance of fur and fat. Summers tested hunger and patience. The world changed shape again, seas pulling back, new mountains rising, new paths opening between continents. Through all of it, the warm-blooded ones adjusted. They huddled together against cold, shared warmth, shared food, shared warning calls. Their cooperation became their strength, and slowly something began to change in their eyes. They no longer looked at one another as shapes or sounds, but as beings, individuals within a group. The gaze lengthened, recognition deepened, attachment took root. In that attachment lay the seeds of empathy. Empathy would one day lead to kindness, to stories, to art. But here it was simple survival. To care meant to endure. At night, under new constellations unseen by any creature before, they gathered. The stars were the same as ours, but they did not yet have names. They shimmered silently over a world where thought was still young. Fur brushed against fur, breathing slowed. The forests, filled with small lights of life, exhaled softly into the dark. Each heartbeat was a tiny echo of the fire that had once ended the dinosaurs. That same energy, once destruction, was now creation. The age of warm blood had turned catastrophe into consciousness. The earth had reset. The long experiment of life had entered a new chapter, one written not in size or strength, but in connection, warmth, and the first soft sparks of thought. The forests were alive with quiet thought, not the kind that spoke in words or wrote in symbols, but something simpler, softer, a hum beneath the surface of instinct, a whisper that said, "Remember." The early primates of this age lived in groups, bound by the rhythm of movement and trust. They groomed each other, shared food, warned of danger, and cared for the young together. Each small gesture, each look, carried meaning. They were building the invisible fabric of awareness, not yet language, not yet reason, but something real. At dawn, the light filtered through green canopies, scattering gold across fur and leaf. Mothers carried infants close to their chests, whispering reassurance in small clicks and murmurs. Older ones climbed high to scan the forest. Younger ones chased and played, learning balance, coordination, curiosity. From play came imagination. From imagination came understanding. Every generation remembered more than the last. What fruit ripened when? What sound meant snake, where water still ran in dry seasons? This accumulation of memory, this echo across time, was thought, learning to speak in the language of survival. It began to extend beyond the immediate. When the forest fell silent, they knew why. When a shadow passed overhead, they ducked before the danger came. They predicted, they prepared, and prediction is the first shadow of foresight. Foresight is the seed of mind. The dawn of minds was not a single event. It was a slow brightening, a sunrise that took 1,000,000 years. No creature woke one morning suddenly intelligent. Awareness crept in quietly, woven into each generation. Small changes in brain, in perception, in connection. The eyes changed first. They looked not just at, but into. They recognized faces, not merely shapes. They began to understand emotion, a raised brow, a widened eye, a tone of sound. They remembered those signals, connected them to outcomes, adjusted behavior. This feedback loop, awareness and adjustment, was consciousness learning its own reflection. In these minds, something new stirred, curiosity without purpose. They began to watch for the sake of watching, to play without reward, to explore without hunger. And play, though it looks like leisure, is the workshop of the mind. It builds pattern, consequence, creativity. It turns repetition into invention. Some of these early primates began to use tools more deliberately. A stick to pull ants, a leaf to collect rainwater, a rock to crack open nuts. The tool was not important. The idea of the tool was. To imagine that one thing could change another, that was abstraction. Each use reinforced neural pathways that favoured imagination. Those who played survived longer. Those who learned taught better. The inheritance of knowledge became as real as the inheritance of genes, and in the shaded heart of the forest, thought deepened. One day, not that anyone noticed, an individual paused beside a pool of water. The surface shimmered, still and clear. A face looked back. It blinked. So did the creature. Recognition. That quiet spark, the awareness of self, may have lasted only a second, but it was the beginning of a new kind of existence. The dawn of minds was not loud. It did not carve mountains or shake the earth. It whispered. It grew in silence, in reflection, in touch. The groups grew more complex. Some had clear leaders, others relied on cooperation. Disputes arose, then resolved through gestures and calls rather than violence. They remembered outcomes, consequences, alliances. Society, the smallest seed of civilization, was forming in the branches. At night, when the forest stilled, they gathered close for warmth and safety. The darkness around them was no longer just threat, it was mystery. The stars above, glittering through breaks in the canopy, pulled at their attention. Patterns were noticed, repetition became recognition. Though they did not yet tell stories, they felt stories, cycles, rhythms, the returning moon, the dawn after night. They lived inside time and began to sense it. Fear was still near, always. Predators still waited. Storms still broke trees. But something was changing within. Fear no longer ruled entirely. Curiosity competed with it. Curiosity is dangerous. It leads a creature out of safety, out of habit. But curiosity is also evolution's greatest gift. It was curiosity that had carried the first mammals through fire. It was curiosity that lifted these primates into trees, and soon curiosity would lead some of them out of the forest. The dawn of minds was the rehearsal for all that would follow: invention, art, story, civilization, and wonder. But it was also the birth of loneliness, the awareness that to think is to be separate. As the night deepened and rain whispered against leaves, one of them, perhaps the same who saw its reflection, reached for another's hand, and together they sat, breathing in rhythm, watching light flicker through. In a world that had learned to be smaller, curiosity became more than a feeling. It became a method. The first tools were not inventions as we imagine them now. They were answers scratched from necessity, tiny extensions of body and thought, a stick to reach fruit, a stone to crack a shell, a sharpened bone to pull meat from a carcass. Simple things, repeated many times, until the repetition itself taught new hands how to move. Imagine a clearing where a small group of primates pauses by a fallen log. The log is split, and beneath it tiny insects bustle in the damp wood. A young individual reaches carefully with its fingers, failing to pluck the insect. It looks around. It finds a thin twig. The twig becomes a probe. With cautious practice, it learns to use the twig to bring food closer. The hand that once only grasped now manipulates. The mind that once reacted now plans. That scene, ordinary and humble, is the doorway to a new order. Hands were the instruments of this change, fingers that could close precisely, thumbs that opposed them, wrists that rotated. These were anatomical gifts that made tool use possible. But it was not anatomy alone. It was attention. It was patience. It was the willingness to try something again and then again until motion and object were aligned as one. Tools did more than procure food. They extended time. A stored pile of hard nuts, opened with a crude rock, could feed a mother and her young through a lean week. A shallow pit could trap small animals. A sharp edge could carve a stick into a spear. Each small technology stretched survival beyond the immediate. It added foresight to hunger. The introduction of controlled fire became perhaps the single most transformative step in this era. Fire warmed cold nights and transformed tough roots into edible food. It cleared patches for new growth. It kept predators at bay and gathered groups together in ways that nothing else could. Around a controlled flame, voices lengthened. Stories could be held in that circle because the fire kept the world at bay while attention turned inward. But fire was also dangerous. Learning to handle it required respect, timing, and a sense of consequence. The first controlled burns were tentative, sparks were coaxed, not commanded, smoke signalled caution. Yet when mastered, fire became a social centre. Food shared by the embers strengthened bonds. Lessons told by fireside were remembered. The flame taught more than warmth, it taught cooperation. Making tools refined motor skills and attention spans. To shape a stone into a cutting edge required repetitive action. It required seeing a potential shape in a raw piece of rock, then patient removal of flakes until the edge was right. These actions cultivated a new kind of patience and planning. Hands learned to anticipate outcomes. Eyes learned to judge angles. Brains learned sequences. Trade and sharing followed naturally. A well-made flake or a sturdy spear was valuable. Groups began to exchange goods and skills. One clan might specialize in flaking stones, another in gathering certain plants, another in tracking animals. These exchanges required trust. Trust required memory and social norms. In this slow web, culture began to form. Language itself grew subtle roots here. At first there were simple calls, alarm, joy, hunger. But as tool use and cooperation deepened, the need to describe actions, to point, to instruct, to remember, became stronger. Gestures grew precise. Vocalizations lengthened into patterned sounds that meant more than emotion. A specific call might mean, follow this trail, another, stay away. The sharing of technique, the passing of a recipe for making a better spear, demanded a system of communication. The more complex the tool, the more useful structured signals became. Tools changed relationships with the environment. Before tools, animals adapted to what nature offered. With tools, animals could change nature to fit their needs. A cleared patch could be coaxed to produce the same edible plants each year. Stones could be brought and set to hold up a temporary shelter. Pools could be dammed to catch fish. Technology, simple at first, created a feedback loop. Each improvement made life slightly more predictable, which allowed more complex behaviours to evolve. This feedback loop also changed cognition. Problem solving spread from individuals to groups. When a group worked together, some digging, others watching for danger, another carrying water, the brain's social networks expanded. Memory and empathy grew hand in hand. To teach a child how to use a sharp flake required patience, repetition, and anticipation of mistakes. Adult behaviour adapted to this new investment in the young. Care extended for longer. Childhood became a time for learning. Minds grew larger, not because of single mutations, but because of a sustained social environment that rewarded learning. Patterns of learning hardened into tradition. A group's method for shaping a spear or for lighting a hearth became part of its identity. Those traditions survived not because they were written, but because they were useful. They were passed hand to hand, voice to voice, generation to generation. Consider tool-making as a conversation across time. The hands that first struck a stone were in dialogue with those that would later refine the edge and with those who would sharpen it once more centuries hence. Each flake removed or shape refined was an answer to a previous problem. The artifact was not just a thing, it was a memory. Material choices also mattered. Bones were shaped differently than stones. Wood required drying and selection. Plants had seasonal rhythms. The selection of materials taught observation. You had to know which wood split well, which stone flakes predictably, which fibres bound rope without snapping. Knowledge of materials became a form of expertise. Expertise was a resource. Those who mastered it could trade, could teach, could lead. With tools came new art forms. A decorated handle, an engraved bone, a simple pattern woven into fibre. These were expressions that went beyond utility. They communicated identity, status, belief. Tools began to carry stories on their surfaces. They became symbols as much as instruments, and with symbols came reflection. A decorated spear might commemorate a successful hunt. A painted stone might mark a place of memory. Small gestures of art indicated a mind that could think about itself. The act of making something with care implied an inner life that valued beauty as well as function. On the plains, a hunter adjusted a spear, testing its balance in his hand. He showed it to others. A child reached out and touched the shaft, felt the grain. The elder taught how the spear should be held against the shoulder, how to gauge wind, how to wait for the right breath before throwing. These were complex lessons, not only physical but temporal. They taught timing, patience, and the ability to imagine something ahead in time. In caves and shelters, paintings began to appear, charcoal on stone, fingerprints smeared into ochre. These were not merely decoration, they were acts of remembrance, a way to claim a story and hand it forward. A painting of a hunt could instruct, or warn, or celebrate. The colours and strokes were language before words. They connected the maker with others across generations. Tools also restructured power. The ability to make and control technology could elevate individuals. Skilled toolmakers might be consulted in decisions. Those who knew how to kindle fire kept a vital skill. Leadership in these contexts began to favour those who could teach, who could maintain group resources, who could negotiate the sharing of tools and food. But tools were double-edged. They could be used to harvest, to build, to cook. They could also be used to take territory, resources, or life. As cooperation grew, so did conflict. Groups competed. Territory mattered. The first skirmishes over prime hunting grounds began to shape politics of a different sort. Strategies born from tool use evolved into strategies of group behaviour, alliances, displays, and sometimes violence. All of this was quiet, slow, and ordinary. There were no sudden leaps, no miraculous revelations. Instead, there were countless small acts of adjustment and learning, each nudging the arc of evolution in subtle ways. The toolmakers did not think of themselves as inventors of history. They were teaching their young how to break a nut, how to light a small flame, how to sharpen an edge. Yet those small lessons echoed forward. becoming the scaffolding for complex minds that would one day speak, build, and imagine worlds far beyond the clearing. By the time seasons had rolled through dozens and hundreds of cycles, the landscape was transformed. Tools were commonplace. Fire was a hearth. Shelters were planned. Social rituals, from food sharing to mourning, were practiced. Memory belonged not just to individuals, but to groups. And so the era of simple tools matured into a culture of technique. The hands that shaped stone and wood also shaped one another's minds. What began as small, practical acts became the first stages of technology and tradition. The story of human progress is not a straight line, nor a simple ladder. It is a dense braid of practice, memory, environment, and connection. The earth never stopped moving. While hands learned to shape tools and minds learned to remember, the planet beneath them shifted, slowly but endlessly, as if it too were alive. Continents drifted, seas closed and opened, mountains rose and wore down. The ground itself was part of the story. This new age, the age of change, was not defined by any single invention or creature, but by the rhythm of transformation that tied everything together. It was the age when nature and life became partners in design, shaping each other through wind, water, and will. The world of the mammals was now diverse beyond measure. Forests, plains, swamps, and ice each offered their own demands. Some animals grew thicker coats and learned to store fat for winters that lasted months. Others grew sleek and light, chasing prey across endless grasslands. Life had adapted to motion, to change itself. The climate was restless. Glaciers advanced, then retreated. Rain shifted from one continent to another. Rivers that once ran to the sea were captured by new mountains or vanished into the desert. And every time the earth changed, life followed, migrating, transforming, inventing new ways to survive. Among the early humans, descendants of the primates who had played in forest light, this change became a teacher. They learned that the land could not be trusted to stay the same. They followed herds as seasons shifted. They built temporary shelters that could be taken apart and rebuilt wherever needed. They learned to read the sky, to know when rain would come, when the wind would change, when the air itself whispered of cold. In the savannas of Africa, tall grass swayed like an ocean of gold. It was here that the next transformation began, the one that would separate the human line from all others. Standing upright, the early humans could see farther across the plains. They could spot predators, find fruiting trees, track migrating herds. Their arms, now freed from walking, became hands for carrying and crafting. Their spines straightened, their balance shifted, their brains grew. Walking upright changed everything. It changed how lungs filled, how heat left the body, how eyes scanned the horizon. It changed how they thought. To stand and walk meant to anticipate what was ahead, not just what was near. The mind stretched outward to match the view. Fire, once a fragile companion, became a constant ally. It followed them wherever they went, a carried flame wrapped in embers, glowing in a cradle of bark and ash. With fire came control of warmth, of cooking, of fear. Meat became softer and more nutritious when cooked. Fruits and roots became safer to eat. The diet expanded, and with it, energy. That energy fed the brain. The growing mind did not simply make tools, it began to question them. Which stone cut best? Which tree burned longest? Which paths led to water even when rivers ran dry? Each answer was stored not in writing, but in memory, in the songs and habits of the group. These early humans lived in rhythms that echoed the earth itself: migration, repetition, renewal. They sang as they walked, their footsteps keeping time with heartbeats and horizon. Each step was a story, each journey an inheritance. And the earth responded. With every migration, seeds and soil spread. Plants followed the movements of animals. Animals followed the growth of plants. Forests advanced behind retreating glaciers. Deserts breathed in and out with shifting wind. The age of change was an age of relationship between species, between sky and soil, between memory and adaptation. And in that relationship, a new kind of awareness began to grow. Early humans started to shape the land itself. They built windbreaks from branches, wove reeds into walls, arranged stones into rings. They dug shallow pits to store food, marked paths with cairns. Each small act was a statement. We belong here, even if only for a while. At night, their fires lit up the dark plains. From far away, the glow of one camp could be seen by another. Two groups, strangers, would watch one another's light flicker on the horizon, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were not alone. Out of that awareness came the first cooperation between groups, shared hunts, shared warnings, and sometimes shared songs, carried by voice across the distance between fires. Song was older than speech, and it held something words would later lose, the pulse of belonging. When storms came, they faced them together. When droughts arrived, they remembered old paths. When a child was born, the group moved more slowly, adjusting its pace to the smallest heartbeat among them. That was the first civilization, not walls and cities, but empathy. The long experiment of evolution was reaching a threshold. The air was cooler, the seasons sharper, and the world demanded minds that could remember, plan, and dream. From this demand, the first humans emerged. They were not gods, not miracles, just animals with slightly larger brains, stronger hands, and a deeper hunger to understand. Their faces were familiar, but not yet ours. Their eyes, though, already carried that quiet spark, the one that asks why. These early humans stood upright and walked long distances. They could follow a herd for days without rest, carry food and fire, and read the land as if it were language. They knew the smell of rain before it fell, the shape of wind over dry grass, the soft footprint of prey pressed into the soil. They belonged entirely to the earth, and yet they had already begun to dream of mastering it. Their world was dangerous. Predators still hunted the plains, great cats, packs of wild dogs, crocodiles waiting in rivers. But humans did not need claws or fangs. They had each other. A lone hunter was fragile. A group was unstoppable. Together they tracked, encircled, and outlasted anything that walked. Their power was not strength, but cooperation, the invisible weapon no other creature had fully grasped. They shared food, tools, and memory. They marked the world with signs, a stone here, a cut there, a pattern that meant something only to them. They began to name the world in gestures, sounds, and song. Language was being born, first as rhythm, then as symbol, then as meaning. Imagine them at dusk, gathered around a small fire. The hunt is over, bellies are full, the night wind hums across the plain. An elder moves a hand, shaping a story in the air. A child watches. The firelight flickers across eyes wide with wonder. A sound escapes the elder's throat, not random, but deliberate. A word. That word is remembered, and the next night repeated, and the next shared. From one fire to another, words spread like embers on the wind. In those glowing circles of warmth, humanity's truest invention was forming, shared meaning. With language came memory larger than the body. Lessons could be stored not only in muscle or instinct, but in sound. A warning could travel beyond sight. A plan could live beyond the moment. The species that spoke was no longer bound by the present. The first humans became storytellers. Stories carried knowledge, where to find food, when the herds moved, how the rivers rose. But they also carried feeling, pride, loss, awe. Through story, the human world expanded from what was to what could be. Over time, tribes grew larger. They learned to build shelters from stone and hide, to weave branches into walls, to keep the fire alive through long migrations. They painted the caves where they slept, leaving handprints on stone, a quiet declaration, we were here. Those handprints, found tens of thousands of years later, are the first written signatures in history. They speak not of conquest or power, but of existence, a need to be remembered. As language and art deepened, so did empathy. The sick were cared for, the dead were buried. Tools were made not only to hunt, but to carve, shape, and adorn. Adornment itself was a revolution, a sign that humans had begun to see beauty, not just function. They wove beads from shells, carved lines into bones, painted with ochre and ash. These gestures, seemingly small, were the beginnings of culture, the expression of inner life. They meant that survival was no longer enough. Humans now sought meaning. They began to watch the sky with purpose. The sun rose and fell with perfect rhythm. The moon changed shape, disappeared, and returned. The stars stayed fixed while the world below moved. In these patterns, humans found time. Time became story. Story became belief. Belief bound tribes together. A shared myth turned strangers into kin. Fire circles grew into camps, camps into communities. The first humans learned that unity was strength, not only for the hunt, but for identity. To belong was to survive. And as they spread, out of Africa, across valleys and deserts, over ice bridges and into new lands. They carried that invisible inheritance, language, memory, cooperation, imagination. They reached the edges of continents, faced new skies, and still they adapted. They made tools from stone, bone, and wood. They shaped flint with such precision that even today the marks look like art. They tamed wolves and found in them partners. They learned to plant seeds and wait. They began to stay. Staying changed everything. Staying meant planning. Planning meant future. Future meant hope. They no longer wandered as echoes of the earth. They began to shape the earth itself. With every generation, they moved a little further from nature's mercy and a little closer to mastery. But the memory of the wilderness, of the cold nights, the hunger, the awe, remained in their bones. It whispered in their stories and dreams. The first humans had no word for progress, yet they lived it every day. Each tool, each song, each fire carried forward the same idea, that life, fragile as it was, could still reach for more. The earth had given birth to something new, a creature that could not only survive change, but create it. And with that, history began. Night had always been the same, long, deep, endless, but for the first time in history, the dark no longer ruled. Firelight pushed it back. Around every small flame, the world of humans expanded. They gathered in circles, faces flickering in orange glow, eyes reflecting light and memory. They spoke of hunts, of storms, of births and deaths. But slowly the words changed. The stories became more than reports of what happened. They became why things happened. That question, why, was the first bridge between survival and imagination. When a child asked why the rain fell, or why the moon changed shape, an elder would answer not with proof, but with poetry. The rain was a spirit's tears, the moon a hunter's lamp, thunder the voice of something greater than themselves. These were not lies. They were maps of meaning. The storytellers were the first teachers, the first historians, the first keepers of memory. Through them, knowledge survived. Through them, the tribe remembered who it was. As humans spread across the continents, their stories spread with them. Each mountain, each river, each fire had its own tale. The earth became sacred through the stories told about it. Wherever a fire burned, it carried the same heartbeat, a pulse of belonging. In caves, paintings glowed in torchlight, red horses, black bison, handprints layered over centuries. They were not decoration, they were myth in pigment. Each animal painted was both memory and prayer, a way to thank the hunt, to call it again, to make the invisible visible. These early myths were the scaffolding of civilization. They gave order to chaos, rhythm to fear. When lightning struck a tree, it was not random, it was a message. When the seasons changed, it was a cycle of life and death that mirrored their own. The storytellers connected the tribe to the universe. They turned terror into lesson, loss into meaning, survival into ceremony. They gave shape to the unknown. Language grew richer around them. Words multiplied, forming patterns that shaped how people thought. A tribe that had no word for tomorrow could not plan far ahead. A tribe that invented a word for dream could imagine worlds beyond their own. Every new word expanded the borders of the possible. Music was born from these same fires. Rhythm came from footsteps, from heartbeat, from rain. Voice became drum, hand became melody. The first songs were prayers to the unseen, to ancestors, to the sun, to the hunt. Through music, tribes remembered their stories when memory failed. The storyteller was not always the leader, but their voice carried the deepest power, the power to shape belief. A good story could unite a tribe, justify a hunt, explain a tragedy, or comfort the dying. The first leaders learned that to rule people, you must rule their stories. And so began the oldest truth of civilization. Whoever controls the story controls the world. Time moved, and stories became systems. Belief became ritual. Ritual became religion. The gods grew numerous and complex, some kind, some cruel, but all born from the same need to explain and belong. Stone temples rose where campfires once burned. Priests replaced elders. Words were carved into clay, written into scrolls, spoken into laws. The oral became the eternal. The human voice had found permanence. But with permanence came division. One tribe's story became another's heresy. Wars began not only over land or food, but over meaning, over whose truth was real. The same imagination that had once united began to separate, yet even through conflict the stories evolved. They built architecture, literature, art. They inspired invention, exploration, rebellion. Every empire that rose did so on the foundation of a story. Every empire that fell was buried by another one. In the quiet between battles, there were always those who remembered the old ways, the fires, the voices, the breath of one mind reaching another. They carried stories of kindness, of curiosity, of respect for the land. And those civilizations rose and crumbled. That gentler current never died. It lived in lullabies, in myths whispered to children, in the rhythm of rain on roofs. The storytellers had outlasted the warriors. Their gift was not control, but continuity. From painted caves to printed pages, from song to script to screen, every age of humans has built itself from stories. They are the threads that stitch together memory and dream. A species once defined by survival became defined by meaning. We are the only creatures who can live twice, once in the moment and once in the telling of it. And so around every flame, every voice, every page, the same pattern continues, the echo of that first question asked by the first child under the first stars. Why? The storyteller answers softly, because we were here, because we remember, because this is what it means to be human. The story comes full circle. The world that once belonged to thunder and shadow now hums with the sound of machines. The descendants of the small, trembling mammals, The ones that hid beneath roots and soil while the giants perished have become the new rulers of Earth. They walk upright across continents connected by light instead of land. They command fire still, but it no longer flickers in stone hearths. It burns inside engines, inside screens, inside stars of their own making. The age of flesh and instinct has become the age of thought and design. The new giants are not measured in size, but in reach. Their minds stretch across oceans. Their voices echo from satellites. Their memories live in clouds of invisible data. They have built mountains of glass and steel, rivers of current and code. They have learned to split the atom, to map the genome, to touch the edge of space. For the first time in history, a species can see its own beginning and its own end. They have uncovered the fossils of the ones who came before, the bones of the true giants, and understood what wiped them away. They know that power does not mean permanence. They know that every empire, even one made of silicon and light, stands on borrowed time. Yet still they build, still they dream, still they tell stories. At night, when the noise fades, the same ancient questions return, quieter now, but unchanged. Who are we? Why are we here? What will remain when we are gone? The modern world answers with numbers, data, machines that think. But beneath that precision lies the same heartbeat that once pulsed in the dark under ferns and stars. It beats inside the child watching the rain. It beats inside the scientist staring into space. It beats inside every human who pauses long enough to wonder. We have become the architects of our own evolution. We change our environment faster than nature ever did. We build life in laboratories, merge mind and machine, dream of leaving the planet that made us. In our cities, night glows brighter than day. In our hands, the world bends easily, but it bends the same way it always has, toward transformation. The new giants forget sometimes that they too are part of the same earth that once burned, cooled, and grew quiet. They forget that balance is fragile, that silence is patient. But the planet remembers. It always does. Ice melts, forests shift, oceans rise. The same cycles that shaped the world of dinosaurs now shape the world of humans. And somewhere in that rhythm is the quiet warning that has echoed through every extinction. Nothing lasts forever. Yet within that truth lies another, softer one. Every ending creates a beginning. From ash came life. From darkness came thought. From thought came us. And perhaps from us, something else will come. Something that looks back and wonders who the humans were, what we dreamed, what we feared, and what stories we left behind. Maybe they will find the traces, the images, the data, the art, and piece together our rise and fall. Maybe they will whisper the same words we once did, gazing up at a sky unchanged for billions of years. We were here. The story does not end. It never has. The world resets, reclaims, and begins again. We are not the final chapter. We are the turning page, the breath between worlds, the brief light between darknesses, the echo of the giants, and the promise of what comes next. If you enjoyed this journey through time, there's more waiting for you. Subscribe to Stories of Earth for calm documentaries about our planet's past, present, and future, from lost worlds to human origins. Every week, a new story, perfect for sleep, study, or quiet reflection. Explore more videos, share your thoughts in the comments, and help this community grow. Together, we'll keep discovering the timeless stories written in Earth itself.